Okay, hi everyone, and welcome back to Breaking the Spell. I know it seems like we took a hiatus. It's been a while, and some of us have stuff to work in our personal life, so that's why we've been slightly away. But we're back, and with something we haven't done for a long time, which is actually a book review. So today, the book of choice is actually 20 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism. And it's a book by the South Korean institutional economist Ha-Joon Chang. I tried actually to contact Ha-Joon Chang, but to be on our show, but I think he's probably too busy. He's working in the University of Cambridge and probably got many other things to do, so he won't be on our show. But I figured that what I would do instead is to talk about his book. Just to give you a little bit of background in case you're wondering who's this Korean economist. So he's someone, like I said, who works in the political economy of development at the University of Cambridge. He's the author of several very widely discussed popular books, most notably Kicking Away the Ladder, Development Strategy in Historical Perspective. That's kind of like his first major book. Then he had another bestseller called Bad Samaritans, The Myth of Free Trade and the Secret History of Capitalism, and that was in 2008. So that book actually received quite a lot of good reviews from the left, like Noam Chomsky, to the right, Martin Wolf. And essentially, Ha-Joon Chang has a certain argument that people like us, economists, have to take very seriously, which is the idea that countries that had failed to develop had generally followed what we call free market policies, and that while state intervention, that means the government coming in, have sometimes produced economic failures. In general, all right, countries that have relied on what we call state intervention or developmental capitalism, meaning not free market policies, generally have better record than unregulated free market economies, which is essentially very contrarian to what's currently being talked about today, which is the idea that we all should try to get towards what we call a free market economy. So in any case, Ha-Joon Chang produced that particular argument, and he's got a lot of fame because of that. He's even considered one of the top 20 world thinkers in a 2013 Prospect magazine poll. So why am I going to discuss this book, which is already 10 years old? Okay, this book was published in 2010, and that was pretty much after the aftermath of the great financial crisis of 2008. So I want to introduce this book because it really is kind of the first book that made a deep impression on me about the myth of the free market capitalism. And if you don't understand what free market capitalism is, I want you to think of where we are right now in this world, right? We have multinational companies, right, moving very freely around the world. We are told that they need to set up offices, factories, in any country that they please. And that obviously results in workers from different countries competing with each other, for salaries, for jobs. Every country is usually, what I mean by that is most political leaders, right? They are preaching to us, saying that we should strive for more free markets, right? If we have more free markets, there's going to be more goods from other countries that enter our markets, right? And that also includes labor, so not just goods and services, but even including managers, expats, other professionals. And then they should come over to our shores, and obviously that leads to a lot of discussions about, other people foreigners coming over to take the local jobs. And this debate, this tension, is existing in almost every country that I can think of. And furthermore, right, along with that, we are also told by our leaders, right, that this is the way the world will be, should be. And the only thing we can do about it is that we have to compete with everyone else. We have to get smarter, we have to work harder, be more productive. And, because to do otherwise is to become like some kind of like insular and economic dinosaur, right? And as we speak right now, we even have a new narrative, which is that billionaires are good for us, and we should welcome them more, and they should acquire more property, which has just happened, which is Elon Musk just buying Twitter. So that's where we are right now. And what this book really did, even 10 years ago, is to offer a good breaking of that spell, right? It offers 23 lessons or 23 ideas, right, to debunk that myth of that free market capitalism. And I really think that even though it's 10 years ago, really we haven't really improved our discourse. We haven't really taken all these conventional ideas that I just spoke of just now and really look at it and laugh at it or mock it and even realize that it's ridiculous, it's nonsense, right? To think that these ideas have potency and that they're working for us. We are in Singapore, and in Singapore we have our Prime Minister, Lee Hsien Loong, actually once saying that he would rather have more billionaires come to our shores to give us jobs, even if it leads to more inequality. And I think claims like that we shouldn't just accept at face value. So in any case, the other important thing about the book, right, and Unsu and Santosh, and I imagine for the general listener out there, you're probably not an economist, but what Ha-Joon Chang does in this book also, along with many other books that I can talk about, is to expose the field of economics as something that is quite corrupt and ideological, and that you cannot always assume that a professional economist is producing like an objective truth about the world, that the truth that having a free market economy is objectively true and that it's better for all of us, right? So what he talks a lot about is that economics is really about politics, that even a free market economist has his own political interests as well. And in fact, he kind of disses economics in general, even being an economist, because he thinks that what has happened with the whole field is that they've become too reliant on abstract modeling and calculations and not even looking at real world evidence and empirical studies. Then the other important thing I just want to say about the book is just that I'm not an economist as well, right? But I think it gives you a very good 101 introduction to international economic history. So I'm going to bring a bit of that into our session as well to show that when he looks at our economic history, right, you can really see the evidence for yourself that free market economies have not really been the way that countries develop. Okay, then the other last few things I just want to say is that because I'm on this channel with Unsu and Santosh, and look, this book is not the most radical book out there. Okay, I think between the three of us, we have much more higher and more radical criticisms and aspirations for where we want capitalism to go. And even Ha-Joon Chang in the book says that he still believes in capitalism being the best system because he doesn't think there's a better alternative, but he just wants to see a better world, a more humane capitalism. And I think whether you agree with that final goal or not, right, whether you want to dismantle or you want to reform capitalism, there are really severe problems with this particular vision that he already brings it out. And if anything, I think some of the arguments that he makes in the book would be really accessible, really intuitive and easy to understand for the general person out there who may not be as well read or not exposed to more radical criticisms. Okay, so last thing I just want to say is that look, there's 23 ideas in the book. I'm not going to go through all 23 of it. So there's just really three blocks, three themes that I'm going to go through. So the first theme really is about what is free market capitalism, what is a free market, and should we really assume that a free market economy is the best way to live? So just touching on one major theme of the book, obviously. The second theme is that when you look at what's happening right now in the world, right, like the way that we're trying to reconfigure it as a free market economy. So there's certain things, for example, like we should pay, rich managers are paid for what they are worth, or we should run companies in the interest of their owners, which is shareholders. Whether you think that the way to promote economic prosperity or to uplift everyone is to make sure that you make the rich people richer, which is otherwise known as trickle-down economics. So we want to get into these ideas and we want to do kind of like a breakdown of that. And then finally, the last block really is just about alternatives. So this book is not very strong on that because it's just kind of like the last chapter or so that he discusses alternative ideas of what we should, how we should rethink, our current trajectory. But I'll bring in just a few themes there as well. Okay, so that kind of sums up the introduction. But before I go into that, right, so that I have Unsu and Santosh just coming in first to talk a bit first, right, to get into our discussion. I want to ask you guys, when was the first time you kind of came across this notion about what capitalism is? And in particular, maybe the first time you kind of understand that it actually produces certain social harms, right? So that's what I'd like you guys to talk about. And then the other thing I'd like to ask you is whether you've tried to speak to people around you. So don't just think about maybe people in your workplace, but maybe friends and whatnot. Like when you talk to them about capitalism, what are the kind of viewpoints they have? Are they generally like very pro? Do they think about the system that they live in? And maybe if you just want to tackle this question, is how would you describe yourself on the political economic spectrum? So maybe Unsu?
Yeah, the first thing that came to mind is me going to Burning Man in 2001. And as I've talked before, that was a profoundly life-changing experience because at Burning Man, which is this experimental community that takes place in the middle of the desert, in the Black Rock Desert in Nevada in the US, there is no money exchange. So the place is completely run on a barter and gift economy basis. And there's no advertising or sponsorship. So when I was there after about like 10 days and then coming back into just normal life, I just became aware or sensitized to certain features of capitalism. So I think that was the moment when I started noticing this oxygen that we breathe or the water that we swim in, which normally you won't notice because it's just the norm. But for the first time in my life, I had something so very different to contrast it with. And I started trying to talk to people about it or talk to friends about what this experience was like. And it was actually quite difficult because unless you have had experiences like that, you can't actually begin to question what is so fundamentally wrong about the way we live our lives now. And looking back, I think the way I understand capitalism is that because it depends on this monetary system and it basically reduces human beings to these one-dimensional, like rational agents who go into markets and they're trying to get the best deal for themselves, to buy things at the lowest price or sell things at the highest price. And this really excludes all these other aspects of human beings that we care about. I mean, the fact that we love art and culture, that we like to be generous, that we, find pleasure in so many things that you can't put a price on. And then I think the third part of your question is, how would I characterize myself now? I'm definitely someone who I would say I'm an anti-capitalist, even though I'm someone who benefits from the capitalist system, but I can see that it's not sustainable. And I actually don't think capitalism is by any means the best way of allocating resources. So we think of economic systems as ways in which a society figures out how to allocate resources. I think capitalism has actually done a pretty bad job because it hasn't been able to meet the basic needs of the vast majority of people. At the same time, it is a system that is extracting resources from the planet at an unsustainable rate, and is contributing to crises like global warming. So yeah, that's kind of where I stand now.
Yeah, I just want to say that last part, there's so much we can get into about how we can produce really strong evidence to show that capitalism is not that optimal system that we think it is. Yeah, and we can probably go through a whole session on that. But anyway, Santosh, your turn.
Yeah, my first experience or face off with capitalism was in 2012, 2013 when I founded two startups, fintech startups. So they were in the industries of peer-to-peer lending and peer-to-peer forex and money transfers. And so we were trying to actually address a very simple problem of borrowing and lending, which banks do, and also transferring money from one location to another location overseas. And those are very simple problems. But in the process of building those startups, we realized that we are up against a a massive power structure. Like the banking and financial industries are taking up or extracting a lot of value from the people who empower them, people who put their monies in the deposits of bank accounts, or people who are transferring funds from one place to another. And I felt very honestly that banking and financing the banking and financial industries don't create as much value as other members of society. Mothers, for example, hospice workers, midwives, you've got people who keep our streets clean, people who transport members of society from one place to another. So there are many other people who create and who sustain society, but they're not getting getting as much from capitalism as banking and finance. And so that was when I first realized that something was wrong with the system. And those who challenge the system to make things fairer, which is to essentially what I wanted to do was to reduce the borrower's interest rate and increase the lender's interest rate so that the margins don't go back to the banking and finance, but go back to the borrowers and the lenders as much as possible. We were up against a force that was very difficult to navigate. And so we failed in those two startup ventures. Yeah, so I think that was my first face off with capitalism. The second phase of my life was when I was working at the Economic Development Board of Singapore. So I was looking at the industry development strategy for the precision engineering industry. And then subsequently, I reviewed the biomedical sciences industry strategy and then the electronic strategy. And in my second year of in EDB at the strategic planning department, I produced and I wrote a white paper on building indigenous capacity in Singapore, which was a critique on Singapore's over-reliance on multinational companies and foreign direct investments, which was the philosophy and the strategy of our economic forefather, Dr. Goh Keng Swee. Yeah, so that was his ethos. And deep in that research, Goh Keng Swee himself issued a warning to all of us about over-reliance on foreign multinational companies and the need to develop our own indigenous capacity from scratch. And the main central thesis of that is that nothing can replace learning by doing gains. So when you're not addicted to foreign direct investments, you find something within yourself to produce from your own indigenous capacity that is far more valuable. Yeah, because you retain what we call learning by doing gains, and you're just relying on people from outside. So that was like the main summary of like the research paper. I mean, I can go through, I can extract parts of that paper and put it in the comments box. Yeah, but since you mentioned MNC strategy, FDI strategy, Singapore was overly reliant on that, and that caused a lot of problems in terms of how we depressed wages at the bottom and then we inflated wages at the top. Yeah, reliance on MNCs and then reliance on foreign nationals. Yeah.
Okay, that's great, man. I actually like that you brought that up because I do think that within our political discourse, some opposition politicians do make that kind of argument, some of them. And I do think this is one of the issues that we have to confront as a country. And of course, understandably, of course, as a country, do we have enough natural resources to, produce on our own? Maybe we don't have that kind of capacity, but we certainly do have, as you mentioned, that over-reliance that has a certain negative effect on us. Then I just wanted to just have you just answer that second question, which is, have you tried talking about this to friends, community members, whatever, about capitalism and what's generally their feedback?
Yeah. So okay, I'm against binary thinking. So when we look at capitalism, then you have the binary of state-driven or you have private enterprise, right? So I'm against all forms of like binaries, and my conclusion after like all of this is that we need to move away from a capitalism that is extractive and exploitative in nature, and towards a form of resource allocation, which need not be called capitalism, that is conscious and regenerative. Yeah, and the best model I found so far to guide our thinking as a society is Donut Economics by Kate Raworth. Extractive, which is the ecological ceiling she puts at the outer layer of the donut, and exploitative, which is the inner ring of the donut that she has coined. Yeah, so we need to build a strong social foundation and have an ecological ceiling. Between the social foundation and ecological ceiling is the donut, where you can give people some free rein in how they transact with one another. But we must protect the foundation and the ceiling. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that's a great way of kind of reframing it as well, that we can try to get away from binary thinking. And actually, although this won't really be maybe our main key subject to discuss today, but certainly one of the points being brought up in the book is that we live in mixed economies. I mean, no matter how you want to look at any country and you want to, say, put a label on it, like socialism, socialist economy or capitalist economy, the truth is that it's all very great anyway, because there's always going to be a mixture of like state-led development and free markets. And the question really is, how much of it is capitalistic, how much of it is quite capitalistic, how much of it is quite socialistic. Just as a slight interesting note, even Ha-Joon Chang would describe Singapore as a country that has two extremes. There are some elements that are very socialistic and some elements that he feels very capitalistic. Yeah. So, okay, let's not take away the main theme of today, which is the book. So like I said, I'll go through the first block. So give me about 5 to 10 minutes to just run through some things first, right? So to whoever's listening out there, right, let's first start with the idea. Okay, what do you know as a free market? Okay, what kind of market do we actually live in? And like I said, the question is really, should we assume that a free market economy is the best? So if you don't really have a good idea what a free market is, just think of it as a system where, the prices of goods and services are self-regulated by buyers and sellers, and there's an open market of voluntary exchange, right? And that there is very little government intervention, that is very unregulated. So if you think of things like taxes, quality controls, quotas, tariffs, all these very centralized, economic measures and interventions, imagine that they either don't exist or they're very minimal. So if you just think of a typical day for you, so, the food that we eat, whether it's fast food, local food, or the restaurants, the telecom services that we have, the energy companies that you're able to use, the movies or TV shows that you're watching, cars, clothes, luxury goods, books. But not only that, but think of like labor, which is yourself, as a worker, or capital, right? Like rich people moving money back and forth, or even yourself, right? So in a free market world, hypothetically speaking, right, the government would do very little to intervene or control the flow of these things. And, free market advocates, right? And there's quite a lot of them right now as we speak, right? They want to see as much freedom, for these things to be available and maximized. So the first thing that Ha-Joon Chang takes down, right, when I just describe that picture, is that the free market doesn't exist. So don't even think like there's such a world to begin with, that where you're given all this kind of freedoms to do whatever you want to do, right? He talks about how every market, no matter what, will have some rules and some boundaries that restrict your choices of what you can do. And that's why he feels that, that's why he says that a free market cannot be objectively defined. It's a political definition, and it's always the government who decides how free they want a market to be. So a good example he always brings up is that back in 1819, in Britain, there was this thing called the Cotton Factories Regulation Act. And basically it was a child labor regulation act where it bans the employment of kids under 9 years old. So older kids were allowed to work, but under 12 hours a day. But because these young kids, right, were working in cotton factories under very dangerous conditions, the regulation was put in place to protect the lives of these kids. Now, here is the question, right? Here is where the free market economist comes in. The free market economist would say, well, these children want and need to work. The factory owners want to employ them. What's the problem, right? And that's where Ha-Joon Chang talks about like how when you look at the freedom of market, it's like in the eyes of the beholder. If you think that children should be allowed to work even at a very young age and be exposed to the dangers of working in a hazardous factory company, then you would not see, this law, this certain regulation as an infringement on the freedom of the free labor market, right? But if you believe in the opposite, you will see this as an unfree market, right? Like this is, government regulation making things worse for us. So if you just use this very simple example, you can see there are also many things in our life. So for example, environmental regulation, so like your car and factory emissions, right? Free market economists will be very against that because they'll say, it's the right of the companies to choose to pollute as much as they want and to make money of it. Why should the government prevent them from making that kind of choice? But you and I obviously on the receiving end of this kind of phenomena, right? And naturally to us, we will see these regulations as something that's necessary and that perhaps is natural, right? Because the idea is that these regulations are required to protect companies from doing things that may harm others, even if it's very unintentional, such as pollution. And these regulations are necessary to also do many things for us, like reduce, say, the human impact on climate change, or to ensure that children's health are not being harmed. In fact, just today, Unsu posted an article from the BBC, which talks about Kellogg's, the very famous cereal food company, suing the British government right now just because they happen to have a regulation in place that prevents high sugar cereal being displayed prominently in the supermarket aisles. And to a company like Kellogg's, that's considered an infringement on free market capitalism. So the idea here is that Ha-Joon Chang provides a good metaphor for us to think about it, right? When we look at a market and we think it's free, it's kind of like looking at a kung fu movie. Like you see, actors, stunt, performing all sorts of flying kicks and all that, but they're actually held by wires, right? They don't actually have that kind of skill to jump and do high flying kicks. So you're not seeing all these wires, all these things that holds up a market and keeps it, as so-called as free as possible. Another good example he gives, and it's quite real for me, it resonated with me, is that he compared Korea and Britain, and he said that when he went to the UK, he found out that there's a certain law in place that allows you to get a full refund for a product that you didn't like, even if there's nothing wrong with it. And I found that to be the case also in Australia. When I was studying in Australia, I bought something like an MP3 player, and my then girlfriend actually said that because I didn't like it after a few days, she told me that, I can return it. But I said, there's nothing wrong with the product. I mean, I can't. Here in Singapore, you have no right to return the product at all. But it turns out you can. And that's another example where if you look at a market, you can reconfigure and make things, either more free for the company who's selling it or even more free for the consumer who's buying it. Yeah. So that's easy to think about, right? Like when it comes to products and services. But now let's talk about wages, which is something Santosh talked about. So another very important point that Ha-Joon Chang brings up is that hence, when you look at wages in rich countries such as ours, actually one important factor that determines the wages more than anything else is immigration, including minimum wage. Because what Ha-Joon Chang argues is that if there's really true free labor market, right, then what you're going to find is that maybe 80 to 90% of the local workforce will be replaced by more productive, cheaper immigrants. The idea here is that we can't objectively define, right, what is the right wage or work condition, but usually there's a lot of room for improvement. And what you see in the history of capitalism is this constant struggle over the boundaries of the market. And that's why we have wars over free trade in slavery and opium, which is, in our shared history. So the idea here for you, right, whoever's listening to this is that, when you look at a market, don't just assume that it's a good thing to want things to be as free as possible. Yeah. So that's kind of the first thing. Is there a few comments you guys would like to make first before I go on to the second thing?
Yeah, no, I mean, these are just really interesting points. And another example that came to mind is, in Singapore, we have very strong laws against drug smuggling. And, drugs would be a case where if there was no intervention, you have a willing buyer and a willing seller, there should be, no issues there. Or in other countries, where prostitution is illegal, I mean, that's another case where in a totally free market, you shouldn't have laws against prostitution because it's between two willing buyers and sellers of a service. So yeah, I would agree with that general point that there's no such thing as a completely free market. I think the other point that I would make about markets is that if you look at the history of capitalism, like companies like the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company, they had their own private armies and mercenaries. And in the early days of capitalism, these companies had to use force and violence in order to create markets for their goods. And even today, in order for companies to access some of the raw, materials and resources that they need governments in a lot of different countries to collaborate with them in making these resources accessible. So even in countries like Brazil, where the indigenous people may say, this is not fair, these are our lands, these are our forests, you can't just cut it down. But the governments will actually send in armies in order to make sure that the resources are available to multinationals.
Yeah, let me just say some great points that you brought up, because I do think that in this book, maybe one, slightly forgive me if maybe I got it wrong about the book, because it's been a while since I read it, but definitely one thing that needs to be talked about is the level of violence that has been unleashed due to capitalism. I mean, Ha-Joon Chang is not going to be, he's not going to hide that for sure, but maybe he didn't talk about it enough, that actually there's been a, we should not ignore the historical violence that has been unleashed, due to opening up markets and these governments as well, working with foreign companies, being against their own people, in order to allow companies to extract those resources. Yeah.
I'll just add, there are two sides to the coin of freedom or liberty. There's positive liberty and negative liberty, and we need both. Yeah, and negative liberty is precisely to protect us against the harms and the violence or the infringement or the curtailing of our human rights. Yeah, and that's why, again, if we go back to the whole idea of the donut, right? The interior is where you protect against the negative liberties that we could impose on the less fortunate members of our society. Yeah, so that's why you give them basic human rights, or you meet their basic needs. And the outer ring is where you protect against the exploitation of Mother Earth that needs to be protected as well, the harms and the violence that we can contribute to Mother Nature. And so negative liberty is really the inner circle and the outer circle. And then between the inner and the outer circle, you can have positive liberty. Yeah, so you see the both sides of the same coin, positive liberty and negative liberty, playing out in a nice conceptual model that protects against harms committed against segments of society that don't have freedom, and Mother Earth or the environment that needs to be protected as well. Yeah, so that's I think, like, in summary, what I would talk or discuss when you want to discuss free market. The idea of free, that needs to be defined. Yeah, it needs to be debated and it needs to be deliberated. Yeah, so the analogy that I came up with, or that came to me, was when you have people driving cars in the transportation networks. Yeah, you give them the freedom to roam around, but there are restrictions that we impose to ensure that everyone is safe. So compulsory seat belts, you provide brakes, people they need to have brakes on their cars. So those are things that we do to restrict ourselves from going amok or running rampant, for example, right? You don't want people to, yeah. And then you also have road signs, you have fines and all of that. Yeah, so I think that in itself is a useful analogy for how we can run markets as well in our society. Yeah, so you've got negative liberties, but you also have positive liberties. Yeah.
Yeah, great plug there, Santosh, because we did do one whole session about that. And for that one, we used a different book by Rob Larson, Capitalism and Freedom, where we talk philosophically about notions of freedom. And yeah, just to anyone who's listening, please tune into the episode where we did do like probably another whole hour of this particular concept. And yeah, and just great metaphor as well. Look at roads, right? Like the road system, what kind of cars are allowed to be on the roads, what kind of regulations and rules there should be. That's a great example where, if you wanted a free market system, then it's almost like, wow, then anything goes. And then you would just see so much more chaos and yeah, a lot more bad stuff happening. Incidentally, that also points out to why rich people should pay their taxes, because that's what keeps the roads stable and working, functioning well. Okay, so I'm still within the first theme, and I'll go to the second idea, which is the last idea within the first theme, which is what Ha-Joon Chang calls, free market policies rarely make poor countries richer. Okay, and this is a very important point because it actually draws on a lot of history as well. So what Ha-Joon Chang, like I mentioned in the introduction, is trying to argue that it is not true at all that almost all rich countries became rich through free market policies. In fact, the truth is the opposite. And with only very few exceptions, all today's rich countries, and he's talking about the Britain and the US, which is, the focus of his book usually, which, like I said, right now in contemporary discourse, the Britain and the US are being heralded as, this is the model of free trade and free market. These countries became rich because of it. The truth is that actually they became rich because of a combination of protectionism, subsidies, and other policies today that they actually tell the developing countries not to adopt. And that's what's so egregious, unjust about the whole matter, because, it's like, it goes back to the metaphor that Ha-Joon Chang had for his first book, kicking away the ladder. Like they used a ladder to climb up to become where they are today, and they kicked it away to tell the other countries not to follow it. So he starts that chapter with a very interesting thought experiment. So I'm going to use it for here. So you guys listen carefully. So he's going to talk about a country. So I'm going to give you this description of a country, country A. Until a decade ago, this country was very protectionistic. Has an average industrial tariff well above 30%. It has invisible and visible trade restrictions, heavy restrictions on cross-border flows of capital. It has a very heavily state-owned, highly regulated banking sector, numerous restrictions on foreign ownership and financial assets. The foreign firms that work in that country complain that they're discriminated against. The country has no elections. It's riddled with corruption. It has opaque and complicated property rights. Its protection of intellectual property rights, which is one of those things that a free market economy is supposed to have, is very weak, which makes it the pirate capital of the world. It has a huge number of state-owned enterprises, many of which make huge losses, but they are propped up by subsidies and government monopoly rights. Okay, before I go to the answer, you want to make a guess which country this is? Can't tell? Okay, let me save the answer for you, okay? Because there's a second country. So this second country is like this. Trade policy is one of the most protectionistic in the world for the last few decades, with a average industrial tariff rate of 40 to 55%. Majority of the population cannot vote. Vote buying and electoral fraud is widespread. Corruption is rampant. Political parties sell government jobs to the financial backers. Government has never recruited a single civil servant through an open competitive process. Discriminating heavily against foreign investors in the banking sector. Foreigners are prohibited from being directors. Foreign shareholders cannot even exercise their voting rights unless they're resident of the country. So you can see it's very discriminated. No protection law. And again, same thing, protection of intellectual property rights is very patchy. Okay, so it doesn't matter, right? They sound very similar, right? The first country is China. The second country is actually the US, but in 1880. And what Ha-Joon Chang points to is that despite these characteristics, which makes them the most unfree economies at the time, they were actually the most successful, most dynamic because of precisely these policies. So anyway, like I said, this is just really Ha-Joon Chang just trying to use historical evidence to show that, hey, if history shows otherwise, why do we assume that becoming a free market economy is better? And even besides these two countries, right, he also talks about like how if you look at, say, Japan, Finland, and Korea, they also have very severely restricted foreign investment. So Finland actually used to classify any enterprise with more than 20% foreign ownership as dangerous enterprise. He also looks at obviously Singapore, so France, Austria, Finland, Singapore, Taiwan. we obviously ourselves use state-owned enterprises to promote our key industries. And one thing he points out about Singapore is that we use 20% of our output. We produce 20% of our output to state-owned enterprises when the international average is around 10%. So look, at the end of the day, right? I mean, what Ha-Joon Chang is just trying to argue here is that, like, when you look at what we have in the world right now, how economies have basically thrived and prospered, is that the state has to do a lot, to build up that kind of foundation, and that even these other countries which are, say in the European countries like Netherlands and Switzerland, I mean, they've actually done a lot of things when it comes to intellectual property rights, where they refuse to protect those patents until the early 20th century. Hong Kong is also another example that he brought up. I try to relate this to something contemporary for us. So I'm going to use the example of vaccine inequality, right? We just lived through, and we hope that we're now living at the tail end of the pandemic, right? We've gone through COVID, and one of the things that was brought up in the international scale was the availability of vaccines. And, we could deal with COVID a lot better if developing countries or poor countries were given a chance to have access to the patents of the vaccines that us in the rich countries have been able to use. So if you really want to solve COVID, we would give these patents up to the poor developing countries, but we didn't do that. Instead, these pharmaceutical companies were able to keep their patents, and hence we live in this very imbalanced, unjust scale where us in the rich countries are just fortunate enough to be able to have good vaccines, and very sadly those countries don't, right? The people there. So in any case, like I said, the drive home point for Ha-Joon Chang basically is that when we look at developing countries, the truth is that what needs to happen for them is that they need to be able to protect and to nurture their own producers before they actually start to go out there and compete in the world market. Basically why he says that, because they are still in the very early stage of development, so there's so many things they have to overcome, from poor transport, poor flow of information, small size of the market, blah blah blah. So the governments actually need to regulate the markets more. So actually, Unsu, I think this goes very well with what you just talked about, like how, sadly speaking, in these other countries, right, what's happening is the opposite. The governments there may not actually be protecting their people, not doing enough to invest in their institutional foundation support, and that's the sad picture that we have right now. And so one of the other arguments that Ha-Joon Chang makes is that we in the rich country should not be mocking them or pretending like it's if the people there are lazier, or they don't have a work ethic, or that they are not as productive. The truth is a lot more complicated than that. So yeah, that's the second point. So any comments, about what I've just said?
I'm wondering if Ha-Joon Chang mentioned Jason Hickel's work at all, because I'm remembering that in Hickel's earlier book, The Divide, he actually talks about how, I think it was in the 70s, there were a lot of countries in like South America and the Middle East and maybe even Africa that adopted some of these policies of protecting their own industries, investing in the health and education of their people. And I think he called these policies developmentalism. And he said that basically it was actually starting to show a lot of success. The prosperity of these countries was slowly on the rise. And then what happened was the US and the UK, I mean, they just started staging coups in all these countries to topple these leaders and stopped developmentalism. So I just thought, yeah, that's such a tragic sort of stage in history.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So I think it's just that Jason Hickel is, a lot more newer on the scene. So Ha-Joon Chang obviously made no reference to Jason Hickel, but yeah, but that history is well known. It's especially in Chile, where it was at one point where the coup happened. It was the Chicago Economists, where Milton Friedman was still alive at the time, and he was essentially one of the orchestrators, to impose free market policies on that country. And as you said, it resulted in the worst one of the worst economic outcomes for that country as well. And you're right, Ha-Joon Chang also did talk about how during that particular period, which as you recall, developmentalism, where they really focus on developing the needs of the people, right? That's where they saw really good economic growth. Yeah. Santosh?
I just have 2 points. The first point is to support the list of examples you've given. And the second point is to, in a way, offer a slightly more nuanced perspective on the examples you've given, which is Singapore. Yeah. So the first point, right, which is to support, when we did the indigenous capacity paper, we cited examples like what you mentioned. In particular, Korea developed the whole Chaebol. And it's all entirely state-driven. Yeah. But this is notwithstanding the fact that power is heavily concentrated in the Chaebols and in the state. Yeah. And so what I'm trying to say is that we need to actually find a way to redistribute the power so that everyone has access to earn a decent living or to innovate or to build their own enterprise without restrictions. Yeah. So South Korea is a great example, and that's how they've thrived. We also looked at the US. The US, actually, the Silicon Valley history is deeply rooted in the military development. Yeah, so the genesis of Silicon Valley is really the support they received from the military. Yeah, there was a lot of state level intervention that created the conditions for Silicon Valley to thrive. Yeah, so it was not entirely private, like ordinary citizens who made it on their own. Actually, the state had a huge role in doing that and enabling that. Yeah, in Singapore, I'm a bit against the argument that we made for our state-owned enterprises, because I think it's not so much about state intervention, but rather how you create the conditions for egalitarianism. Yeah, because if you have a lot of state intervention without distributing power, then you go into the extreme end of cronyism and possibly corruption. Yeah, so it's not fair, yeah, when you have too much power that's concentrated in the state-owned enterprises as well. Yeah, so it's also about creating the conditions for fair, egalitarian ideas to be nurtured, people to be nurtured, yeah, and not just power to be concentrated on just a few people, yeah, who are linked to the state. Yeah, so I think the nuance, right, in how we distribute power is very important, and it need not be in, again, the binary of either private citizens who hold capital or the state that holds a lot of power. It could be another form of stakeholder capitalism, where we try to envision many more stakeholders who could benefit from the resource allocation, the journey of allocating resources and capturing value from the mechanisms that we built. Yeah, so those are like 2 points that I have. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm really appreciative you brought that up. So the first one you brought up was how you talk about the Pentagon system being really responsible for a lot of the advances that we see. And this is a very important point because, to anyone out there who thinks that, the way that we got the internet or the way you got your smartphone, it's not through some genius private individual who came up with the idea, not Steve Jobs for sure. All these things were developed by the state, specifically the Pentagon. So everything you can think of that makes up your phone, that makes up the internet, all the basic building blocks, right? Whether it's the coding, whether it's the semiconductors, all the parts that make it up, right? The only reason why you have these things right now is because of a very heavily invested state-driven research and development into these things. So that's number one. And reason why this is important, at least from a rhetoric perspective, is because when you see a billionaire or a millionaire claim that he's a self-made man or whatever, that's so not true, because even Elon Musk himself was not a self-made billionaire. I mean, he actually is the offspring of a very rich South African of a family that was made money through apartheid. And I believe it's in Emerald or something like that. So whether it's Elon Musk, Bill Gates, who else? Jeff Bezos, Zuckerberg, all these people, if you look into their histories deep enough, you'll find something there where the government may have played a very big part. And especially when it comes to Tesla, which is Elon Musk's company, the argument is still being made nowadays, still that the government has provided a lot of subsidies for him to be able to be where he is today. So this is just a very important point, and goes back to your second point, Santosh, why this is important. Because of power, because it means that, hey, if you, in capitalism logic, right, if I'm an investor and I put money into your company, right, and your company makes a lot of profit, I'm supposed to be entitled to get back some returns. So in this case, taxpayers have put money into very risky, projects, right? Whether it's the internet, whether it's a phone, smartphone, whatever, right? Or even electric vehicles in this case. So there is an argument to be made that when a company does well, taxpayers should then be relieved of that, should be compensated back, because they basically funded money over to these companies to be able to succeed. So when these companies choose to evade their taxes and they try to, like I said, change the laws, right, of the market to make it more accommodating to them and make it more harsh and unequal for us, we actually should have, the right to say this is not the way it should be. And hence, that power distribution should be a lot more egalitarian and much more to our side. And then the thing about cronyism in Singapore, yes, there's also something to be said about dangers of like authoritarianism within state economies. So, China is obviously a very good example of that. But we also have to face that problem.
Yeah. Two other things we learned from the Singapore example. One is bureaucrats cannot predict the winners. So that is exemplified by a lot of money that we lost in the biomedical sciences industry. And I saw the papers and the memos we wrote for the justification for funds to be invested in startups. And the modeling, the predictions, they looked so good on paper, but in reality they turned out to be failures, and then we lost a lot of money. So we need to find a better way of picking winners if it's state-led, and bureaucrats cannot do that because they don't have the experience of the learning by doing gains, which entrepreneurs might have, of figuring out the instinct to figure out who the winners are. So that's one very important learning and insight I made when I was in the EDB. We were analyzing our investments in the biomedical sciences cluster. The second one, right, is our model of tripartism in Singapore, which we feel has got equal power distributed equally across the three parts of the triangle: the workers, the state, and the private enterprise, the owners of private enterprise, right? And our model of tripartism is not egalitarian. It is heavily concentrated. Power is heavily concentrated in the hands of the private enterprise owners and the state. And the workers are deprived of a lot of fundamental rights at the apex, so our model of tripartism also needs a lot of improvement. We need to give back power back to the workers. Unions, like the whole idea of unions is something that we can even go on to, which were designed to protect the interests of workers. But I don't see that happening in Singapore. The model of TAFEP by MOM, and then also like NTUC, which holds all the unions. So those are some nuances that we need to unpack. That should also make us wary of putting too much power at the hands of the state.
I think we can even do like a whole different session about what's going on in Singapore's workplace structure, right? Like in terms of the power dimensions, and like you've mentioned many times about, not many times, but you mentioned it quite a few times about your critique about tripartism, and we can easily go into like a whole session on that. Shall I go on to the next part? Okay, cool. So like I said, the second block, and I think this is really where we're going to spend quite a great deal of time on, really is just expounding on this idea, right? I already mentioned two kind of foundational counter arguments towards free market capitalism, but like I said, right, we're still moving towards it because we are given a lot of arguments every day, right, by, like I said, our political leaders, that this is the way to go and it's going to make our lives better, no matter whatever the history was, right? So here's number one, okay? The number one idea that Ha-Joon Chang also talks about, which is, I mentioned earlier, which is our wages are politically determined. So he basically says that most people in rich countries like ours, we really are paid more than we should be. And he gives a good example where he compares the salary of a Swedish bus driver and an Indian bus driver in India. And he says actually, when you look at the real world data, the Swedish bus driver is paid 50 times more than the Indian one. But he asked the question, is it really that's 50 times better a driver? And he even thinks, because he provides two pictures of India, like one of India and one of Sweden, and he says, if you look at India, I mean, there's like, cows, it's so busy, there's so many things that the bus driver has to avoid. He thinks, if anything, that the bus driver in India should be paid more because he's more likely, more capable, more productive, there's a lot more work to do, right? So the reason why he then says, why the Swedish bus driver earns so much more is because he's protected. Because the Swedish bus drivers don't have to compete with workers from India and any other poor countries, for their wages. And he then extends that idea to not just low-wage essential workers, but even thinking about engineers, bankers, computer programmers, right? And he says, look, there are many, many people like that waiting in other countries like Shanghai, Nairobi, who can easily replace their counterparts in Stockholm, London, and whatnot. But simply because they can't migrate there, so that's why these workers in these rich countries can still have very high salaries. So if that is the case, right, he then asked the question, right, what explains? Because a lot of people will look at the wages and the work conditions, and they'll say, hey, but nevertheless, the people in the rich countries are simply more productive, and free market economists tend to point to like the capability, right? The human level skills. But what Ha-Joon Chang talks about is that no, it's not about the humans themselves, not the individuals, but the system. Because it's not that the people themselves are cleverer or they're better educated. It's really because they are simply living in a economy that has better technology, better organized firms, better institutions, better physical infrastructure, and that's what led to increase in productivity. Another good example that people really should be talking about a lot more is Warren Buffett. He was once asked, that if he were to be a resident in another country, would he be able to be as rich as he is today? And Warren Buffett is one of the more honest investors out there who said no. He said, drop me in the middle of Bangladesh and I will be just a poor farmer and nowhere near where I am right now. So why is this really important? And I want to bring us to something at least in Singapore. Even as recent as in budget 2021 last year, we still hear from our political leaders, in this case, our Deputy Prime Minister Heng Swee Keat, that the way to improve our lives is to raise productivity. This mantra still exists, and to anyone who's Singaporean, I mean, you don't even have to be Singaporean. If you're living in America right now, you're basically told the same trash, right? Which is the problem with why you're not earning enough wages is because you're not productive enough. And that's why we need to reject that myth. We need to reject this argument that people are actually paid according to their individual worth. They're not. Really, if you let markets, be as free as possible, you're going to see, a lot more fluctuation, and you're going to see a lot more chaos. And here's an important point also as well. Ha-Joon Chang is not making the point that, that he would like to see, immigration control, that there will be no immigration control and borders are free. I mean, he understands that there's a lot more other reasons why a country would want to, have restrictions and controls on their immigration, right? But he's not a free market economist, so he's not arguing for that. What he's trying to say is that if you're a consistent free market economist, then you should be willing to let competition in all areas and boundaries and all classes, right? So that's one particular renunciation. So let me go to the second one, because then I think we have a lot more to discuss before that. The second one that's also very important for people like us, right, is this idea about equality of opportunity. So again, in Singapore and other countries as well, as political leaders confront the idea that there's rising inequality, how they try to counter that, right, is they say that we're going to provide more equality of opportunity, meaning that whoever's poor out there will always be given a chance to rise up in society. But Ha-Joon Chang makes the point that, leading on from what I just said earlier, if the wages are politically determined, then it's the same thing with equality of opportunity as well. The problem is that there's not equality of conditions for people to compete. So a very simple example he uses is that if a child does not perform well in school because he's hungry, he cannot concentrate in class, he's living in a much more horrible home condition, it's simply not enough to just give him a chance to compete in the marketplace. I mean, in the first place, he's coming from a very disadvantaged position. So hence to him, unless there's equality of outcome, and he thinks there must be some equality of outcome, it doesn't have to mean that everyone gets the same salary, but it needs to be made a lot more egalitarian, right? Equal opportunities are just not meaningful enough. And in a very funny way, right, he actually talks about this with a historical example. Okay, so here's a bit of history. The idea is that among free market economists, right, such as Milton Friedman, they kind of make the argument that the market would be that place of great opportunity. Why? Because if you're an employer, right, you wouldn't want to hire someone just because this person's white, this person's black, and this person's brown, and you would want to kind of like not care, about race. You should just want to hire just based on their abilities. So that's what a free market is supposed to be about. But here's the interesting thing, like in history, right? In South Africa, even in a very notoriously racist, even during the notoriously racist apartheid regime period, I mean, even the South Africans had to designate the Japanese as white because they needed to kind of like reconcile that cognitive dissonance that, hey, this person is of Asian descent, but because we welcome them to market, we're going to call it white people. And so the idea here is that, like, this example provides to us is that the social economic environment is just really important, because if people want to put you in a place in society, they would do things, right, to give you a place, right? And the same thing also with the South African example is that, Santosh, you mentioned it just now, negative and positive freedom, is that even when apartheid was, kind of dismantled, right, and there still exists obviously strains of racism still in South Africa, but it didn't really make things better for Black Africans to be able to enter universities if the schools that they go to are poorly funded, they didn't have, really good teachers, they have to teach themselves, simple, educational skills. So even though there is new opportunities, it didn't matter because they just don't have a chance to make use of it. And so what Ha-Joon Chang talks about is that what you see in South Africa now is kind of like what he calls a cappuccino society. So meaning that there's a mass of brown at the bottom and a layer of white at the top, and just a sprinkling of coca, meaning that there's only some ethnic minorities that are able to make it through the system. But by and large, most of the people are still, at the bottom. Yeah. So in any case, like I said, the main takeaway here is that, which we talked about, before in a few occasions, that equality of opportunity is just not a sufficient condition, and we really should do a lot of other things, right? And that would include something as simple as improving the school system, right, to ensure that that the children really start from a much more equal playing field. Yeah. Okay. Perhaps you guys want to jump in a little bit first with some comments.
Santosh, why don't you go first?
Yeah, so this brings me to the article that Unsu had shared with us, but it's a New York Times article. And I think it's by Elizabeth Anderson, who is a political philosopher. Yeah, and she talks about a few things that you need to get in place. It is not just equality of conditions. I think she argues that when you look at equality, it's not just distributive equality. So you don't want to just distribute the resources equally amongst all levels of society, but it's another form of equality that she highlighted, which is relational equality. Yeah. So relational equality is really the area where government policy, despite its best attempts at distributive equality, cannot encroach in, which is the human mind. Prejudice, implicit bias, covert forms of discrimination. These are things that happen. There are barriers within the human mind where no amount of external policy, things that you put out, can enter and can alleviate. Yeah, and this is why to address and to resolve relational equality, it's important that we intermingle and intermix or integrate different parts of society as early as possible in their childhood. So people growing up with a diverse bunch of other people from other ethnicities, race or class, socioeconomic status, they grow up intermingling and seeing one another and relating with one another as equals. That's the only way you will be able to alleviate or to mitigate the barriers that we have within our human minds. Yeah. So that's the two things she mentioned. She mentioned a third thing, which is to increase and to increase the range of values that we have in our society. So we value only a narrow subset of all the goods and services or skills and attributes that we have in our society. And we need to increase the range of things that we value. So caregiving, for example, should be put at an equal level of value as banking and finance, for example. Yeah. So that's those are like some other things that we need to put in place in addition to equality of conditions, which are a lot more subtle and cultural or mindset in nature, if we want to create a market that is truly free in a way. Yeah.
Actually, since you brought up Elizabeth Anderson, she has this book called Private Government that I've been reading, and it makes a really interesting point, which is that we may talk about free markets and all that, and we can talk about the tension between the state and businesses and business, but when you look inside most corporations, they actually operate like mini governments. I mean, as an employee of a company, you actually have very little rights. And yeah, if you actually, describe the workings of a typical corporation, it starts sounding very much like a communist government. It's like if you work for Apple, you're not allowed to have a Samsung phone, A lot of employees are limited in the kinds of political expressions they can have outside of work. So yeah, I think if we want to talk about freedom, and at the end of the day, what really matters is people, then we actually have to look inside all these companies and actually ask, are people truly free? And the thing is, a lot of people would say, well, yes, they are, because if you don't like the company that you work for, you're free to quit your job and, take another job. But the reality is that in a lot of people, just depend on their jobs for livelihoods, right? So there's actually less freedom than people think to move around or to choose among different companies. And all these companies, they all operate similarly anyway. So, yeah.
Yeah, let me come in with 2 points. So first thing, I'm glad, Santosh, for introducing Elizabeth Anderson. So I also read her work, sorry. It's been quite some time though, so I'm glad to hear from the two of you, some refreshers on that. And yeah, and along with what Unsu just mentioned, yes, when you look at a person joining a company, right, it's like, as you said, it's a form of private government, because in the first place, you spend most of your working hours working for the company. Most of the time, you have to fall to a certain dress code. You can't dress what you like to wear. You have to make sure you check in at a certain time. You have to check out at a certain time. Even for some companies, even after work hours, you're still expected to work for them, because otherwise it keeps you not being productive. And then there's also the fact that certain companies will prevent you from taking a second job. So you're not allowed to moonlight. And then, of course, for some jobs where it's understandable, maybe such as being a teacher, where you have to be, kind of like have a certain moral code outside of the school, so you have to still behave very decently, not wear a bikini or something like that, referring to an old tabloid case. But in any case, yes, the idea here is that even the norms and the social attitudes, the way you conduct yourself in public, it's still kind of attached to your job. And so you can see there's a certain shackle of your own freedoms when you work for a company. I hope that in the future we can do this, which is, I have this documentary, and it's a book as well called The Corporation, and it's produced quite a long time ago, but it's basically like I say, a film and a book that talks about how the corporation is actually kind of a pathology machine. So let's talk about that maybe some other time. But I'd like now to actually do something fun with the two of you. So like I told you just now, right, we are now on this argument about how wages are actually politically determined. And I got a great example. I should have mentioned this just now. So on Mothership, which is a local Singapore website, there was an article about how a Melbourne restaurant is willing to pay $5,500 monthly salary for someone to cook roti prata. Because what's happening in Australia right now is that due to COVID, right, and this really illustrates Ha-Joon Chang's case, his argument, that because they have restricted immigration flow due to COVID, so the restaurants, right, the F&B outlets there have very little, supply of labor, because the students, maybe poorer immigrants, they're not in Australia right now. So a friend of mine actually told me that he's heard stories of a dishwasher maybe being paid $75,000, yearly, for washing dishes. And this friend of mine also then provided me an interesting comparison. So he said that there is a job for someone to kind of like guard the streets where the children cross the roads. So I don't know what you call such a person, but he's just making sure that the children cross the road safely. And that this person is being paid $100K a year, so maybe 10,000 a month. Yeah, and he asked me, right, because he knows I'm more left-leaning, would you think that's justifiable? So I'd like to ask you guys, what do you think?
I think, if I guess in a free market where it's supply and demand, there's a high demand. I think they're called crossing guards. If there's a high demand for crossing guards and limited supply, I guess it would be justified under a free market. It's a nice example. I'm happy for these examples of people with unconventional jobs that are getting paid a lot. It's a refreshing change from hearing about bankers and lawyers and CEOs getting paid so much. So I personally have no objections to that. It does raise questions though about like all kinds of other jobs that should be paid more. And really what is a fair way to set wages? I don't know what the answer is, but it raises important questions.
Santosh? Yeah, I think we need a process of deliberation or participatory democracy where citizens come together and we list down the list of basic services or goods that everyone needs to have access to. And those are what we call inalienable rights that citizens need to have. And we need to then pay decent wages for all of this. So, and if cleaning is very important, transportation is very important, hospice, nursing, and all of this other range of what we call essential jobs, they are important, then they need to be paid fairly and decently. Yeah, because they are like the foundations of society. Yeah. So I think there needs to be a process of deliberation where citizens come together and through a process of consultation where such discussions are held. Yeah. And I think you need to bring people into the process. And it's okay if we make mistakes in the first few rounds, but I think it's the process of active citizenry or civic consciousness that you're cultivating or inculcating in the citizens to realize there are a lot of invisible jobs that are necessary and essential, and they have not thought about it. They live in a world that through free market economy actually renders a lot of these jobs invisible and not so important. Yeah. So I think for me, it's a process of education as much as deliberation. Yeah, where citizens come together to discuss what is essential, what's important. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
I think that's,
no right answer there. Yeah, but yeah, the process matters. Yeah.
yeah, I definitely agree with that. That first thing, you got to have some kind of what I call procedural justice, right? So how are we going to deliberate about someone's salary? And in this case, we are talking about a public service job because this person is kind of like, protecting the safety of school kids, right? When it comes to private market, so if you're thinking about the dishwasher in a restaurant, that's a bit harder to determine. But I would say this, right? Just like Unsu, I don't know what the right answer is, but I will say that given that we do know from real world data and research, right, that the wages of most people, right, we're talking about the working class or the middle class, have stagnated for the last 40 years. And it's really only the incomes of the very filthy rich that have ascended tremendously. I mean, CEOs the salaries of CEOs have disproportionately, risen in comparison to the average employee out there, right, by hundreds of times as compared to maybe in 20 years ago or 40 years ago, it was only just 20 times or 30 times. So if yes, a dishwasher is going to be paid $7,000 a month because he has to make up for all that loss of salary loss, income loss, right, over the years. Yes, I mean, maybe he needs to have $7,000 a month. Likewise for the crossing guard, right? Like if for a decent person, for a person of a decent living in a highly expensive city, yes, maybe it is justifiable for them to have such high incomes, and more importantly, that all that money is not redistributed to the top. So anyway, I guess
So just to add on,
yeah,
like I think we had this discussion on the minimum income study that was
yeah,
led by Ng Kok Ho and Teo Yu Yan. Yeah, and what is most fascinating about this study is not the outcome of the study, but the process through which they did this, which was a mix of ethnography and deliberation. Like they went on the ground and they really looked at the lived experiences of these people, and then they from ground up they determined what the minimum income was. So that study was like essential. Yeah. Before you get to the 9,000 or 7,000 figure that you came up with. Yeah. Yeah. So I think those are like things that we need to put in as processes.
Yeah. Okay, so I have a few more other points. So let me just run through it very quickly. So I mean, the other thing is just obviously, like I said, a very common thing we also hear right now in contemporary discourse is that we shouldn't tax the rich disproportionately, and they just really mean like raise it just by a few percentage points, because they insist that if you do so, that it will affect the incentives, right, of these people, because we assume that they're the most productive, which, as I just discussed, is not necessarily true. But Ha-Joon Chang makes the point, right, that I think going along with what we've been talking about, all three of us, about this idea about equality, relational equality even as well. He talks about how if you look at the average worker out there, right, you need to provide some kind of buffer for them, because let's say if they lose their job, right, and we have many cases of conglomerates, MNCs, just doing mass retrenchments, right? That's not their fault that they're now back into the labor market, and when they lose their jobs due to reasons not of their own, right, they actually are very much held back in society, and it's not easy for them also to just simply retrain or reskill themselves and then just go to a whole new sector. Like one line that I like from the book, he says is that you don't see many American steel workers or shipbuilding workers who left their industries because they got retrenched, suddenly become bankers and engineers and whatnot, right? I mean, people just are not able to switch to another occupation entirely. And this is such an important thing, because right now as we speak, right, in Singapore even as well, where the state does take a very active role in trying to encourage and nudge people to reskill, to prepare yourselves for mid-career switches, right? This is used as the panacea, as a solution to a person's economic insecurity, right? How are they still going to generate livable income for themselves in their middle years? And for a lot of people, this is just not the solution. When people are displaced from their previous occupation or what kind of primary work that they're used to, they need to be given a lot of unemployment benefits, health insurance. There's a lot more help that needs to be given. And Ha-Joon Chang points to how in the Scandinavian countries you do see that kind of investments being made for people like that. interestingly enough, right, he also points to international studies where it's not a coincidence that the stronger the welfare state, the higher the social mobility. Again, another concept that we find, in our contemporary discourse, that, we're not supposed to, provide all that kind of welfareism because it affects the incentive structure, it affects people's motivation to work. But the truth is the opposite. The truth is that if you provide a lot more welfare, right, then you have a lot more higher chance of guaranteeing that people don't end up in poverty and they're able to make some kind of basic income. So again, goes back to the idea about the equality of opportunity is just not enough. Okay, then here comes the next part. And this part actually gets a bit interesting because I think I can actually relate this to many things that you can see right now, not just in Singapore, but in the in countries like Korea and Japan. And that pertains to that high stress educational environment that we are, all, soaked in, right? So one of the arguments that Ha-Joon Chang takes down is the idea that more education, right, meaning the idea that we all constantly upgrading our educational skills, does not make a country richer. So it turns out that actually there's very little evidence that more education leads to greater national prosperity. And that what actually happens is, what we actually find actually is that knowledge, right, the way we conventionally think of it, is not the main source of wealth, right? And to me, that kind of makes sense, because otherwise, why aren't the brightest people in universities and governments and people who are actually quite humane making the most amount of money out there? Instead, we got, shrewd people, business people who are, making that kind of money. And look, I think for anyone listening out there, they may find this statement really outrageous, right? How can you say that, especially any of us who are Asians living in Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, right? We got high educational achievements, literacy rates. How dare Ha-Joon Chang says that this is not, at the very least, accountable to why we live in economic prosperity. But he points to some very interesting facts. So, for example, he says in the 1960s, Taiwan had a literacy rate of 54%, while Philippines was 72%. So meaning Philippines was actually, more highly educated than Taiwan. But despite that, right, as you can see by now, Taiwan is actually one of the best economic growth performers in human history, but Philippines hasn't. And in that sense, what is happening is that the income per capita in Taiwan has actually become 10 times higher than Philippines. He also points to a comparison between Korea, who had 71% literacy rate, against Argentina that had 91%, but now Korea's per capita income is 3 times even higher than Argentina. So the idea here is that he's trying to say that it's not just a given that having higher education means that you're going to have better economic growth, and there's 3 main reasons why. So the first thing is that not all education is meant to raise productivity, right? So you can just imagine anyone that does a social science degree like I did. So, if you study literature, history, whatever, right? I mean, from a strictly economic perspective, and many of our parents think that way, they say that these subjects are a waste of time. Why are you studying this kind of stuff, right? It's not going to make you economically productive. But, what Ha-Joon Chang talks about is that in the first place, you don't go to school necessarily so that when you come out of that school, you're going to, work in that particular field, right? So even he points to the idea that investment bankers, right, they're highly educated, right? But they don't go to school to study biology and chemistry and all that. They don't actually need that subject. And even if they study maths, they don't even need to actually use what they study in school to become good at their jobs. So really what has happened, and this is, I think, the sad fact of where we are right now in society, is that an educational degree is just simply a piece of paper to denote a certain competency about your general intelligence. And so if you don't even have this piece of paper, that's the reason why companies, don't want to hire you. Because generally what they're looking at you is that, okay, you're not a trustworthy person, you're not someone that survived the school system for X amount of years. So regardless of who you truly are, like whether you're very reliable or you're very capable, I mean, that paper now is used to denote your place in society, not really so much about, what you studied. The second reason what he talks about is that, going back to what we've been talking about earlier about state investments and infrastructure, is that the reason why productivity has increased in countries like ours is because of mechanization. So really it's just due to the idea that we invest a lot more stuff into all the infrastructure, all the tools and technologies that we need to boost our productivity. So just think of machines, right? Like right now we got self-checkout corners, self-checkout kiosks, We got all sorts of other stuff, like, electronic payments, infrastructure. So all these things really are the more important factors that has raised a country's productivity. And in fact, he points to the idea that if you take Marxist perspective seriously, you would say that a capitalist would actually try to de-skill their worker, because you're going to use a mechanized production approach, because that's going to be a lot more easier to produce profit versus the worker, because the worker is easily replaceable. And the idea is that you generally want to go towards things that will make making profit easier. Yeah. And then here's another important point that he talks about, which is that whole relationship that we have, right, with higher education and economic prosperity is not so straightforward. And he gives a very good example of Switzerland. So he says that Switzerland, as you know, one of the few top richest and most industrialized countries in the world, but it actually has the lowest university enrollment. So compared to other OECD countries, it's like at 16% versus 34%, although it's increased by now. But if you take a country like Finland, which is 94%, US 82%, Switzerland is still like at 47 apparently. So in any case, right, the reason why is that, as I said just now, it's really because at the end of the day, what matters isn't so much what you study for, it's really because that piece of paper is used to denote, like I said, some kind of general intelligence and to earn your place in society, to work. Now, what he feels is that over time, right, this has led to what he calls degree inflation. So now that everyone has a university degree, you're not expected to do a master's or a PhD in order to stand out. And so what has happened is that, and I'm quoting here, is that the higher education system has become like a kind of theater where some people deserve to stand to get a better view, while prompting others behind them to stand. And everyone has to keep kind of like going, standing against each other, and it just escapades the intensity of inequality. So there's some very good way of like relating to this, okay, and that's for Santosh. Unfortunately, I have to talk about TV and media a little bit here. So if you look at South Korean drama, and by now, South Korean TV shows have become very sophisticated. So like you can see that private tutoring has become like one of the most important levers to get to a good university. And there's even like dramas produced, like I'm talking about soap operas, like Sky Castle, one series that I've been told about, where it depicts that kind of life. And he basically says that due to this intensification of the degree system, right, the idea here is that it's contributed to the myth of meritocracy, which we did talk about, right, which is the idea that it's produced this spiral of thought that, especially for those of us who may have benefited from the system, that we think that this continues to work, like the idea that if you just get a degree, you'll be guaranteed some kind of fulfilling, life or a good job. But the truth is that that system has actually been broken down, right? By now, we can see that what helps to keep someone in a higher income status is usually inheritance wealth now. It's not so much, what you are able to produce on your own or social mobility. So what Ha-Joon Chang worries is that, we still live in that myth. We still think that this is the only way that the system works. Yeah. There was something I wanted to bring up here, but basically the idea here is that he just thinks that what should we do about this, right? Is that we shouldn't have to worry that we need everyone to go to university. The more important thing here is that maybe we need a healthy rate of people going to university for all sorts of other reasons, whether you want them to be smarter or to be active political citizens or stuff like that. But the idea here is that we can accept an economy where degrees don't have to be the ultimate arbitrator of what your salary should be. So yeah, so that's kind of like the last point before I want to go to alternatives. So you guys want to contribute anything here first? Yeah, thoughts.
I generally agree with him. I think what I was thinking of as you were talking is I don't know if was he still framing it in terms of like a country doesn't need to have a lot of university degrees in order to have economic growth. And And I think what I was just thinking of is that you did acknowledge that Ha-Joon Chang is still kind of operating, roughly within the framework of conventional economics. So I'm wondering if, he still accepts that we do need economies to grow perpetually, and if he doesn't actually question that, because I think where I would be coming from is that so much of the education that we have today is still supporting the old paradigm, which is, like continued growth. And so even if you were to say, okay, we don't need so many university degrees, but really what is the bigger picture that you're operating with? Like I would say, we need less specialists and more generalist people who can really connect the dots, because we live in very complex systems now, and we need people who can really think like really big picture and question some of like our most deep-rooted assumptions. We need people who are, more into like caring, like developing the abilities to improve our mental well-being, improve our physical well-being, just basic things to do with health. So yeah, I'm generally, I would generally agree that I think our societies should stop focusing on just really expensive degrees and start refocusing more on like basic things. But I suspect that my reasons are a little different from Ha-Joon Chang's in the sense that, I have this kind of ecological framework that I'm working with, that I'm not sensing that he has. That's just some of the thoughts that were running through my head listening to you.
Yeah, I think this is a good time to come into this now, because we are pretty much at the last segment of our discussion, which is, our own ideas, what are the alternatives, what are the solutions would we like to see. So of course I need to later just present a little bit at least about what kind of ideas he gives out, like what kind of other solutions he has in mind. You're right. I think he's not an ecological economist, so maybe that's just not his focus, but it doesn't mean that he doesn't recognize, for example, climate change, or that we do need to reform the system to address this kind of very, catastrophic effects, right? And in terms of your exact statement about question about like, okay, does he assume perpetual growth? It's a very good question. I've only felt that to be, like this exact definition of capitalism, right, as the perpetual growth of a business or a markets of economy is really something that comes from degrowth. And many other economists still don't identify that as the key characteristic of what a capitalist economy is. I've also, like we were talking about how, you want to avoid binaries, right? So you can be anti-capitalist and still accept that there will be markets. And, markets can just simply mean, like, for example, I was in a restaurant talking to a friend, and we were in a Thai restaurant. So, we were talking about politics, and we were saying that, okay, we still want to see many different types of Thai restaurants around. We're not saying we don't want to see individual businesses and stuff like that. But definitely we don't want to see a restaurant that perpetually grows and then usurps and becomes the only Thai restaurant you see around. And maybe this Thai food restaurant is the only one that's, exploring the earth, and, and soon you're not going to get all the nice fishes or curries or whatever, right? So that is a form of capitalism. That is something that can still be within a capitalist system, in the sense that you could still have very sustainable businesses, economies, markets. But I just feel that you need to have very, very tight controls. You need to reform somewhat the core features of that system, so it won't look like capitalism as the way it is today. And I think to some people, right, like it can be pundits, it can be lay people, they might start to say, okay, that's something else, maybe they call it socialism or whatever, but it just won't look like what it is today. But it doesn't mean there's no markets. So that's how I will kind of address that question. I think for Ha-Joon Chang, he's not so dogmatic to define himself one way or another. Like I said, the reason why he has faith in capitalism is because being South Korean, right? I mean, he talks about how in the single lifespan of a South Korean, their livelihood, their living conditions have improved vastly. So I think he has faith in the system that, capitalism does provide the goods, right? It can transform a person's life. But I think he's very careful about how much growth there should be and how much free reign capitalism should have. So that's why he has a certain kind of old school kind of view. Yeah. Santosh.
Yeah, so I just have 2 points. The first is an example, and the second is an analogy. All right, so let's go with the first example. The part about having good degrees does not necessarily lead to an economically prosperous life. This is evident when I was in the precision engineering industry. In the Swiss craftsmanship, the industries which are revolving around Swiss craftsmanship, and the German Mittelstand companies that we have, which are the small and medium-sized, companies, SMEs in Germany. And what we noticed, right, that model does not emphasize a lot of academic education, but another model of what we call apprenticeship. In apprenticeship, you're not front-loading education and then getting on into the industry. Actually, the industry is coupled very intricately with education. In industry submerges itself and interacts very deeply and intimately with education. People in the industry, they come into the education and they teach the students. Yeah. And then the education is also enmeshed in the industry. So people are not front-loaded education and then they move on into industry. Rather, they're coupled, they're enmeshed very nicely. Another wonderful insight that we learned, right, in studying these industries and why they're so successful is that they are the apprentice, the students from young, as they enter the industry, they're not taught how to do very well in their skills, but rather to cultivate a wholesome set of values, human values, social, emotional skills, how to relate with one another. So the master craftsman who is at the peak and advising and mentoring the young students or apprentices in the company itself, he's not so much focused about making sure that the students earn a good living or do the best like in the skills that they have, but rather in developing a whole and a wholesome individual. Yeah, so people who talk and relate with other employees with respect, who value inclusion and diversity and equity, for example. So these are the whole range of values that are passed down from the master craftsman industry to the students at a very young age. Yeah, and it's a lifelong process of developing this whole concept of a whole human being. Yeah, and I think that is the very important insight we learned. It's about life skills rather than just economically prosperous skills. Yeah. Now, the second thing that I wanted to talk about, right, which is the analogy, right? And this is what we see in agriculture or in farming. Yeah, where if you emphasize only economically prosperous sectors in the industries and the education sector to just be optimized for these economically prosperous sectors, then what you do in the agriculture analogy, right? You're optimizing for, let's say, monocrop output or yield instead of soil health, which is more important if you want to have sustainable farming. Because if you're over harvesting and over farming for just one type of crop or a few types of crops which are economically prosperous, then over a long period of time, the soil health will deplete, and that undermines the yields of those first few crops they're optimizing for in the first place. Which is why I'm a strong advocate, not for just STEM subjects, which are economically prosperous subjects, but a whole range of fields and disciplines that Unsu is talking about, a broad range of disciplines that includes not just STEM, but the arts, the humanities, civics, education, so that we develop whole human beings. Because what we need to watch out for is the culture, the soil health, and not just economic prosperity, which is one of the many other indicators of a wholesome society. Yeah. So we want to build a thriving civilization or wholesome society and not just an economically prosperous one. Yeah. Yeah. So those are like two things that came to my mind that I think we need to be very wary of.
Yeah, I like your second point about how if you focus too much on basically let's give it kind of a term like only instrumentally rational, productive, objective measure type subjects or measurements, right? Then you are having a very close and very myopic view, right, of the whole of the whole system or of the whole even in this case you're talking about agriculture, so even of the whole phenomena, right? Because in this case, you're only focusing on very certain variables and you're not seeing the bigger picture. And this bigger picture perspective, actually, I don't know, honestly, whether you took this inspiration from a recent book called Range, which is about how generalists triumph over specialists.
Yeah, no, I'm familiar with it, but actually more recently, there was this YouTube video by this guy, Nate Hagen, and yeah, he just really made the point that it's fine having specialists, but in order to tackle some of the big problems we have today, like we need people who can really, like, we basically have islands of expertise, but very few people who can build bridges between them. And because it's otherwise, a specialist can be very good at solving a problem in his or her domain, and at the same time be creating problems in other domains, right? So and I guess being a journalist myself, I have a stake in promoting the benefits of being a generalist.
Yeah, no, I actually do agree with you a lot. I think I've also seen very similar arguments made by well, there's a movement coach that I'm familiar with. So he made an argument that I used to work that I used to train under, just to give some context. So he actually gave an argument where he said that he feels that many of the social problems today are produced by specialists, right? People who only have a certain point of view and a very enriching one. It's not to say that the point of view is wrong or that we should discount it, but the problem is that it's not complemented, not supplemented with other perspectives, other narratives. And he thinks that the world can literally be a better place if we were to elevate people of that sort. And you can see with some of our leaders as well, they tend to be a particular kind of specialists, either economists, doctors, engineers, or something like that. And mathematicians, military. So yeah, there's no of a certain kin, right? Certain kind. Okay. One more thing I wanted to mention, Santosh, sorry, was that you talk a bit about the whole that whole atmosphere, the whole environment of being of a certain mindset, right? And what one can describe as a technocratic mindset. And so I also think another way to describing this whole system, right, besides it being capitalistic, is that it's very economic metric trained kind of system. And there's a book actually maybe we may want to do in the future, which is called the Econocracy. And it's actually written by a couple of economics, like PhD holders and stuff like that, who actually criticize the field of economics and say that the problem is that economics has engendered this world where everything's measured in this very narrowless point of view, and that is inherently a problem for everyone, for society. So yeah, okay, so I'm going to kind of wrap it up. So actually, you guys brought it up already, which is how we require more generalists basically to represent, to lead, to have some say, in the way economics is run. And Ha-Joon Chang makes the same point. He says that actually professional economists have not done a very good job. They, in his opinion, they have actually led to one of the worst things we've seen in the world: lower economic growth, greater economic instability, increased inequality, and of course, like I said, this book was written at the time of the 2008 financial crisis. So he was kind of like essentially lambasting the entire field, right? I'll just read out a few things, right? Like he blames them for basically playing an important role in many other crises, such as the 1995 Mexico peso crisis, the 1997 Asian crisis, 1998 Russian crisis. They provide theories and ideas that justify policies that lead to high inequality, heightened job insecurity, more frequent financial crisis. They've weakened the prospects for development in developing countries. And in the rich countries, they encourage people to overestimate the power of new technologies, make people's life more unstable, ignore the loss of national control over the economy, and rendered workers to be complacent and incompetent. So yeah, so he basically thinks that the whole field has gone to in a hell basket. And so from his perspective, obviously he's a bit like I say, economics trained. So he just thinks we need different alternative ideas from other economists like John Mayen Keyes, and Hyman Minsky, Karl Marx, Joseph Schumpeter, Albert Hitchman. So he mentions all these names, and basically his point is just that we need a range of ideas from different economists, not just the free market economist ones. And that's one good way that we can just kind of broaden the thinking around economics. I just want to talk about this thing, okay, which is the movie Parasite. Santosh, maybe you didn't watch this movie, okay, but it's a very famous movie. It was the first foreign film to win, Unsu, you should know this, the Oscars, the Academy Awards in 2019. Okay, and the film, just to give some background, a quick summary, it depicts a Korean family, a working class family, and a very, rich elite family. And why the movie is called Parasite is because it's the way they kind of live off of, leech off each other. And what Ha-Joon Chang talks about, right? If you watch a film like that, Parasite, why it resonates so much with people, why people love the show, is because it depicts a very grim reality of Korean society right now. So some things he points out that the show does allude to, the idea that Korea actually has one of the highest suicide rates in the world among OECD countries. Like Singapore, its fertility rate is below 1.0. It's considered one of the countries with the biggest gender wage inequality, and obviously very high inequality that's comparable to the US and Israel. And Santosh, you mentioned the Chaebols, right? You mentioned that just now. So he says that South Korea, right, is degenerated from a society that used to provide prosperity for everyone to one that as we're talking about right now, as due to that liberalization, right, the economic liberalization, there's also been provoked by the Chaebols, right, the Chaebols, right, it's led to all this increased economic insecurity. And what has also happened is that these small local businesses, and he talks about like mini marts, they've all been overtaken by large businesses, which are like supermarkets. And so what has actually happened in South Korea is that, which I think, okay, this is the reason why I'm mentioning it is because I think it parallels Singapore a little bit, is that it's led to this huge number of self-employed people. So Korea is actually one of the highest number of self-employed in the world. And that's why in films like Parasite, you see a lot of commentary about the characters talking about setting up their own shops and failing in their businesses. And Ha-Joon Chang did say that one prevalent trend in Korea was that they tried to set up fried chicken stalls. It's a very popular thing for the local people to do. What actually happened is that as a general societal trend, a lot of them went out of business, went bankrupt, and that led to higher poverty. And you can see those threats in a film like Parasite, where what happens is that because they have no jobs, they've lost their business, they have to resort to being chauffeurs for the rich or tutors for the rich. And that's how they're competing and struggling against each other for economic survival. And hence, the overall picture that it's being depicted about South Korea is that there's a sense of hopelessness among the younger generation, that they're no longer happy. That's why low fertility rate, and they don't see any prospects for them to have a better future. So I think when you look at an example like that, you can't help but feel worried as well that we can follow that same result if we're not careful. So anyway, just to sum it up, like I said, other things he mentions in the book is, which honestly you probably like, he mentions that how human rationality is very limited, severely limited. We need to build a better system that, brings out the best in all of us, that takes into account different kinds of ideologies, right? Some specific things that he talks about is just like banning complex financial instruments, because like one of the things that he feels is problematic is that we don't give some of these things enough runtime to see whether they're actually quite socially harmful. So when it comes to very complex, financial instruments, and we didn't talk about it much today, but the point is that like what led to the 2008 financial crisis is due to, the products and services of like the financial industry, and because of these products that people bought into, it led to that collapse, and we need to be much more careful about stuff like that. Actually, same points that you guys made. He feels that you should strike a better balance between like finance and real activities, and real activities to him is really like what you guys mentioned, caregiving activities. He has a special kind of place in his heart, I guess, for like manufacturing. He thinks that we need to make real things more and take them seriously more. So I think along with what you said, Unsu, if we paid more attention to the manufacturing, economy, maybe we want to make sure things are much more greener, sustainable, not so ecologically harmful. Instead, spend less time trying to boost the financial industry. And I should say that's a special problem in its own right. Yeah. Essentially the last thing he kind of ends it up with is that, so you just need to understand the context of this argument. In America right now, there's always this tension, debate about like big government, small government. And Americans are very upset, usually libertarians, the libertarian segment of the population. They always want to have small government. They constantly make that kind of argument. So Ha-Joon Chang is addressing them and is trying to say there's nothing wrong with big government. A government that actually functions, that is accountable, that is democratic, that is actually what we need. And in that sense, why this matters in our conversation is that we don't really have to worry too much about the government approaching our lives or the economy, if, as you said, Santosh, if it's egalitarian, if it's democratic, if we actually have some kind of active citizenry and participation in it. And I think that is, the heart of the problem right now. So, and that's something Ha-Joon Chang talks about, which is we do need more active economic citizenship. Yeah. Okay. So just to cap off, what do you guys think? What do you guys want to see in against free market capitalism? What would you guys prefer to have?
I think let me just try and put a few thoughts together. I think that government will always be there. Like in any aspect of life, even in a family, we need some form of government, right? And the important thing, I think, is for whatever government we have to be accountable at the end of the day. So like when Elizabeth Anderson talks about, private, like companies being these private governments, she's not saying that we can not have government. She's just saying, let's recognize that companies operate like governments and let's make them accountable to the workers that work in it. With this whole question of markets, I think right now, capitalism as a system is incentivizing all the wrong behavior. So it's incentivizing accumulation of profit at the expense of people. And as a system, it really depends on companies and holders of capital being able to outsource all the externalities. So they get to benefit from the profit, but then all the waste and pollution and negative effects, they basically outsource out. And a lot of times that, that's where governments have to foot the bill for all these externalities. And there's some simple ideas, like there's this idea that Nate Higgins has, which I think is worth considering, which is that right now we need to increase dramatically the taxes paid on non-renewable materials and resources. So all the minerals and materials that go into making your iPhone or your smartphone, companies should pay massive taxes on that because those are non-renewable. So it may mean that the phones start costing a lot more. And by the same time, there should be zero tax on human labor. So right now, like majority of taxation is on human labor. And he's recommending that, if a worker earns 50,000, they should keep every single cent of that. And so that would start, reshifting our economy to value people and to support people's time and labor, and to tax the things that we need to consume less of. So yeah, those are just some final thoughts of mine.
Santosh?
Yeah, I think in addition to the ideas we've discussed in our previous episodes, like minimum wage, basic sustenance, something that stood out to me, and this is what Unsu brought up, was Monbiot's idea of public luxury and private sufficiency. Yeah, if we could model a society that builds that, yeah, we focus on contributing to a broader public luxury where everyone can benefit from public spaces and goods and services. Yeah, and we minimize and we try to optimize for private sufficiency, right? That would be like an ideal. But underneath all of this, right, I feel like it's still not enough unless we embrace like a philosophy or a mindset or spirituality around Ubuntu. Ubuntu, which is, you know, when we go deep into the level of the identity of a young person growing up in any country, and when you cultivate this sense of Ubuntu, what Ubuntu means is I am because we are, you know, and from young, when we have social integration across all levels, race, religion, socio-economic status and all, and students, so once they are integrated and they're intermixed, and then they grow up thinking that my existence is intricately or tied with the existence of another individual and the environment. Yeah, and when that is lived and experienced from young, then I think we can create a new like society where, yeah, it's not just individualistic. Yeah, it does not become coercive, extractive, or exploitative, where we look to cooperate and we optimize for everything, for everyone's existence. Yeah, so those are like some things that came to my mind. I don't know whether that made sense, but yeah, I think it's really at the heart of the matter, like mindsets and like, yeah, a new spirit of existing and being. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes sense. So where I slightly differ from you is that, like, you would be what I consider philosophically the idealist, whereas I consider myself a bit more materialist. I think that the ideas are great still, but just that you got to find some way to make it manifest in institutions. But in any case, right, I think along with what, just to go along with what Ha-Joon Chang is saying, which is like, we do need to reform these institutions to quite literally bring the best out in all of us. And that's what he thinks is problematic with free market capitalism, which is it brings out the worst in all of us. And I really appreciate how you guys added in some interesting ideas as well. Like you say, Unsu, with the idea that, you know, you shift the tax burden to all the ecologically harmful activities and the people, I mean, not people, but the companies that perpetuate it, right? And then, and along with what you just said, Santosh, how you need to reshift the power levels, you know, in any market economic system or labor markets as well. And that is the task for today. So anyway, I guess just some final thoughts. So like I said, this is, you know, a book review. We've gone even beyond that, I think, with so many other stuff that's going on right now. And, you know, I just want to just basically say, you know, quick recap. This is the book, like I said, that kind of started my journey going into let's just put it, anti-capitalist thought, essentially. And I think it's a good book for anyone to read. It's easy enough to read. It's very pragmatic in some sense, in the sense that it's just the first layer, right? The first layer of anti-capitalist critique that you can find. And then, you know, if you go deeper into it, you know, say if you pick up from some of the stuff that Unsu and Santosh are talking about as well, we've gone even deeper, you know, going to degrowth and into other subject areas. And with where we are right now, like I said, with say the Ukraine war, inflation, Elon Musk buying Twitter, the climate crisis not getting any better, I think more than ever we need to take these arguments seriously, and we need to work on that project of like I said, either reforming or dismantling capitalism or free market capitalism to some degree. Okay, so that's kind of it. Thanks everyone for listening all the way through, and hope to see you in the next one.
All right, thanks Douglas for introducing this topic. Yeah,
Thanks.
it's fun talking about it.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Douglas.
Bye everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.